This lecture is about the risk that exists in every sales opportunity, but before we can talk about those risks, we need to spend a few minutes on the inherent risk that exists in all business, particularly business growth. The idea behind purchasing new software or equipment, any strategic transaction in which this curriculum applies to, implies some level of professional business development or growth. So that's why we need to talk about this first. So chiefly, the thing to consider about business growth is just how difficult it becomes to actually execute on anything new. So this first bullet point item says that ideas become promises, and that is exactly what it means. You may have an idea as a small business owner or an entrepreneur, a solopreneur, but then as your business grows and becomes more complex, think of it going from $100,000 in annual revenue to $1 million. You start to add people and systems and complexities. Take that 1 million to 5 million, and then 50 and 100 million. As this growth occurs, it becomes more and more difficult to make decisions and to get things done. So you may have a great idea, and it may come from you as the solopreneur, the CEO, the head of the board of directors, or it may come from someone in middle management. Wherever it comes from, it's very difficult to get those ideas across the finish line and actually turn them into real business opportunities. So that's one of the key things to keep in mind. And these others are also important. For example, the needs of the business changes. I've already alluded to the fact that as companies grow, they add more employees and systems, but they also have to keep up with regulatory requirements. So whether it's state regulations or federal regulations, or even some third-party boards that dictate or have influence over how your product will be observed by the market, it is a requirement that organizations pay attention to these things. Some of these things are referred to as AS900, AS9100 certification, or SOX compliance. These are challenging, cumbersome opportunities for organizations to address. So keep that in mind too. It takes people, systems, and processes to get all of that done. And these are systems, people, and processes that otherwise probably wouldn't exist within the organization. There's also competitive differentiation that becomes more and more important to your business. So for example, if you run a small consultancy and it's effectively just you and maybe a couple of subcontractors doing the work, you're selling yourself. You're selling your experience as a consultant, as a business person to your prospect. But as you grow, and now you're offering a service, so it's a set of ideas or methodology that's executed by multiple consultants that are partners within the organization consultancy. Now, how do you differentiate from everybody else who does that, everyone that you compete with in a sense? So as businesses grow, they become more and more difficult to manage. Which brings us to risk reduction. As a sales professional, you're entering into these organizations with an opportunity to help them with this growth. And it's important to understand that from their vantage point, they have risk as well. So what are some of their risks? Well, their risks can be that if they don't make the right decision, they could lose their job. And that might be in 6 months or in 2 years, just depending on the size of the purchase and the implementation time and support time. So they really have to trust you, particularly if you don't have a super recognizable brand, a lot of cachet. Now, as a sales professional, if you don't understand the whole picture, you create a lot of opportunity for risk. Now, the key thing to risk is that you cannot allow the things you can't control to occupy you. And I've seen a lot of good salespeople who will focus on trying to manipulate rather than support their customers and their prospects. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to take complete ownership so their boss doesn't yell at them, or so they can definitely get the win, so they can go off and buy something nice, a new car, whatever it happens to be. And I'm generalizing, but you get the idea here. So what is the whole picture? Well, the whole picture is not just the person you're working with who may be a decision influencer, but it's also decision makers. So you have to reach those people, and we have another lecture on that that's already available. Now, additionally, you have to keep in mind what is their history, because their history as buyers informs their perspective, and your own history as well. What have they done with your competitors in the past? If they had good experiences or bad? Because if they had a bad experience with your competitor, that doesn't necessarily mean that they think the world of you. Oh, at least you're not that competitor that I really don't like. They may not be thinking that. They may be thinking everyone in this space is bad, and we need to find a whole different solution other than that. Okay, now there's also just being absent-minded, and this is Like I said, I've seen good salespeople make some mistakes around risk, and I've seen mostly bad salespeople just be absent-minded. So, for example, several years ago in the NBA Finals, J.R. Smith, who's a player for the Cleveland Cavaliers, a yearly clutch, reliable role player, he had an absent-minded moment where he didn't call timeout when he should have, and as a result, you know, bam, the Cavs lost game one. Maybe the reason they went on to lose the entire finals to the Golden State Warriors. So he was just absent-minded. So you don't want to be absent-minded. Here's an example in sales. One point in time, when I was working for another organization, I went through a recruiting phase, or hiring a lot of salespeople. I had a recruit come in. He gave a really good pitch. He role-played very well for the software that we were selling. And it was pretty much his. Game over. We're going to give him the job. And then my boss asked a really good question. He played the role of the buyer in the scenario, and he said, let's go back to this real quick. Now, what if I said this to you? And the objection was, hey, this I can't spend $10,000, so it's going to have to be $5,000 in order for me to move forward. And the recruit who was acting as the salesperson said, you know what, it's going to be hard for us to do, but I'll talk to finance and we'll get it done. So he thought he closed the deal, but the truth is that he was just being absent-minded. You see, the context you don't have is that during this role play, the savings that the recruit presented as a salesperson was somewhere around $40,000 or $50,000 a year. I can't remember. So the appropriate response would have been to my boss playing the role of the buyer. Well, if I'm going to save you $40,000 a year, how come you can't spend 10, right? Like, that's the direction the conversation should have gone. And that's really just being absent-minded, trying to close the deal. So as a salesperson, how do you reduce risk more specifically? So you can reduce risk in sales by understanding exactly what the transaction is. And so we call it boxing it up, right? So you box up everything that's in the transaction, from the levers of complexity around the transaction itself, so quantity, duration, price, all the quantifiable values. We put them all into this box and say, this is what you're buying, these are the terms. Okay, so this is what we're going to center the conversations around. We're not going to talk about anything outside of this, because that just introduces risk. Sometimes you can't control that, so it sounds simple, but it actually isn't, because the buyer, they have a pretty big role to play in all of this as well, and they may bring in some outside of the box objections, ideas, requests, and demands, and as a result, risk just becomes, it starts to build up inside the opportunity. There's also the risk of the buyer just saying no, right? Or not saying no, rather, just saying no decision, right? Just, you know what? We're just going to keep going, and maybe we're going to drag you along on the ride instead of telling you no, right? We're just going to kind of keep things going, and this is a difficult thing. So you want to reduce this risk by asking for the business when it's appropriate, and that's a qualifier that we'll have to dig into in another lecture. Another thing is to prove value, right? Going back to that recruit, for example, he could have said, well, we're saving you $40,000, and I think asking for 10 is reasonable, right? This is the cost for us to do business with you. And that's critical. I have another lecture where I talk about reputation and networking and your personal brand. And the idea of proving value, that means that you sort of have to do it before the transaction occurs. So for example, you certainly want to pull in references when you can, but you don't always want to rely on references. So how do you give before you get, right? And that's one of the rules that great sellers follow, is they tend to give and give before they ask for anything in return. And so you need to prove value along the way by giving and giving before you ask for the business. And then finally, Ben Franklin has this great letter that he sent to a friend. It's been captured and documented many times online. And within this example, his friend asked him how to decide on a complex decision, and Ben Franklin wrote a weighted pros and cons exercise back to his friend in a letter. You can find it on our website, conduitconstruct.com. And it's a really brilliant but simple way of simplifying the problem at hand. And it goes back to the first section here in this slide about putting everything into a box. It's effectively what Ben Franklin did. Is he said, okay, you're trying to make this decision, so here are all the questions that you would ask. What's the probability of these things occurring, and what's the weighted value that you would associate in terms of importance to all of these things? And that gives you your end result, so you can compare the cost of the pro versus the cost of all the cons. It's a really wonderful exercise, and again, you can find it on our website. So one more slide on reducing risk, and that is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So every buyer goes through many many different types of biases during the course of a buying cycle. And so we box them up into one saying called fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So there are many different unconscious biases that the buyer will have, from skepticism to bandwagon effect, things that will affect them as they're buying. And you don't have direct control over this because you don't know their background or their emotions. But we just box it up and say, look, it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So what is the fear, uncertainty, and doubt associated with partnering with you? You got to dig into that to find out what it is so you can address those items and remove them from being a hurdle in your process. Now, additionally, I mentioned a second ago that buying is emotional. So think about if the buyer may feel like it's just too risky to partner with you, to purchase whatever it is you're selling. They may have a gut feeling that says, just don't do this. This isn't right. And overall, they just may not trust you. And people buy from people they trust. They buy from people that they like. And you need to establish that you're someone they can trust and like. And you're not going to do that easily unless you get to the root of the emotional triggers or levers that's influencing the buyer or the buyers. It could be a group decision. So the way we do this is we get the buyer to explain their perspective. And I mentioned the pros and cons exercise from Ben Franklin. You can literally do that with your buyer. Another option is to use the value wedge, which is a wonderful tool that's been around for a long time by Corporate Visions. And this value wedge is a way of aligning everything the buyer wants with everything you have to offer with all the things that you don't. And doing a weighted exercise on that as well to say, well, what's most important to you? Because here's everything we can do. Oh, wait a minute. You thought we couldn't do these things? No. They belong right here in this wedge of value. We can do these things. If you enjoyed the lecture, and please leave your comments below. Thank you.